You know, a lot of people that we've been speaking to about these protests that have, gone global basically say that this is a turning point. We're seeing a change here. Are we? We've seen so many of these protests over and over again.
I would be wary about seeing these things as a turning point. History would tell us that mass protests are not an indication of political movement or change or action. It's not even an indication of what may happen at the ballot box. Remember, there were enormous protests against the Iraq War, for instance, during the Howard term, and the Howard government was returned, who were a great supporter of the Iraq War, returned with an increased majority. During the 1960s, there were protests against the Vietnam War. It didn't mean the government was ousted. You can be misled in seeing the movement of people on the street as a reflection of the broader intention or voting intention or the sentiments of the broader public. But I do think that this does indicate something, and it goes well beyond the particular issue, as important as that issue is, both here and in the United States. And it revolves around an increasing fracturing of democracy, a loss of faith and trust in institutions and leaders, an increasing polarisation and partisanship of our polity. In the United States, for instance, right now, you have a crisis of legitimacy. The Democrats do not accept the Republican presidency of Donald Trump, and the Republicans did not accept the Democratic presidency of Barack Obama. You have huge swathes of the country that will not be governed, and that makes democracy incredibly difficult. Governing over diversity was always the challenge of democracy. Big, diverse populations, deeply entrenched historical enmity around issues such as slavery and the treatment of black people in this case, polarisation around class, inequality. All of these things are contributing to a crisis of democracy right at the time when we see a wave of authoritarianism within democracies, an increase of far-right politics in Europe, and of course the rise of China as an authoritarian superpower.
It's interesting you make that point, because I've also observed in the United States, but also here, a split between the leaders at a federal level and the leaders at a state level, or the mayors in the United States.
Often democratic states versus a Republican presidency. And Republicans will often point to this and say, look, these deaths occur in places that are governed by Democrats. How do you explain this away as being a politically partisan issue? And there, it does go to the tension and the volatility of American democracy. And of course, as America traditionally has been a beacon of democracy, as the Statue of Liberty says, give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. It has been a haven for people seeking a new beginning in a new land, the promise of freedom and liberty, versus a history that doesn't always live up to that promise either. And it's those tensions that we're seeing there, and I think that's now being reflected elsewhere, and other countries such as Australia are also asking about the saliency of our democracy, the strength of our democracy, and the capacity of our country to deal with what are also deeply entrenched inequalities, divisions, historical issues that have never been properly resolved.
One thing that kept coming out, particularly in the early days of these protests in the United States, and it's something that we were talking about, is that many black leaders were asking those on the streets to go to the ballot box, to make the change there through their votes. But if you're saying that people don't have faith in our institutions and in our leaders as well, where does the change come from?
It even goes beyond that. You can vote and still not accept the result of the vote either. Democracy, depends on the consent of the loser, that you are prepared to accept the legitimacy of the process and the outcome of the process, regardless of which way you voted. We're not seeing that necessarily in the United States, but getting out the vote, if you are opposed to the Trump presidency, getting out the vote for the Democrats is going to be critical. We saw at the last election, Hillary Clinton got a greater number of votes because of the electoral college system that works in the United States. It did not necessarily translate to winning the presidency. Getting out the vote in key states is going to be critical if the Democrats want to win that back. The black vote is critical as well, and potentially can be decisive, 13 to 15% of the total population, and in some areas particularly it can be decisive. What's going to be critical, I think, in an election year is whether Donald Trump can hold on to and potentially build his base. His base is white evangelical Christians. That's where he wins. Evangelical Christians have been able to rationalise his personal shortcomings with their own belief in his social and political agenda. He has presented these things as a right or wrong, a battle of the soul of America. So you see him standing outside a church holding a Bible. That's an appeal to the one group of Americans that he overwhelmingly won, and they were white evangelical Christians and white evangelical Christian men. So that dichotomy, that split is going to be really critical in this year. Getting the vote out for people on the Democratic side is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to see a change. But even if we do see a change in politics, that's not necessarily going to mean that we see a change in the malaise or a circuit breaker to the deep malaise that's affecting democratic politics in America.
Obviously, these protests are sparked in the United States with the death of George Floyd, but we've seen yesterday thousands of people turn out across Australia about the Indigenous deaths in custody, protesting against the treatment of Indigenous Australians. What do you see the differences and the similarities are between what's happening in the United States and what's happening here?
The similarities are sharing and bonded in a struggle against racism. There is no doubt that there have been systemic racist policies, a systemic history of racism that affects the outcomes of individuals' lives. There is no getting away from the fact that the people whose land was taken, the people in Australia who have endured segregation and discrimination, locked out of the promise of Australia for much of our history, are also the people who die 10 years younger. That Indigenous people are not yet 3% of the population and almost a third of people behind bars. That after having a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, nearly 30 years ago now, key recommendations such as reform of sentencing laws and being able to keep Indigenous people out of prisons, grassroots changes that would improve the relationship between police and Indigenous peoples, have not worked. We've seen an increase of around 100% of the numbers of Indigenous people incarcerated, and since the time of the Royal Commission, more than 400 Indigenous people who have died in custody. Those things are analogous with the United States. When you see someone such as George Floyd killed, it reminds Black Americans of a history of slavery, of a history of lynching, of a history of segregation, of the failure to realise Martin Luther King's dream of a nation where you're judged by the content of your character and not the colour of your skin. These things become emblematic of a deeply troubled history. And of course, it's reflected in contemporary numbers. The numbers of Black Americans who die at the hands of police is substantially higher than the number of white Americans who die at the hands of police. So to that extent, there is a similarity. Here, I would make a distinction. America's democracy is in a far more parlous state than our own. I would argue, and one of the reasons for this is that we have compulsory voting, that we have not seen to the same extent as Europe or America the populist surge that we've seen in those countries. The fracturing, the crisis of legitimacy is not as deep here as it is there. But that should only tell us that we have an opportunity to do better, that we have an opportunity to look at how we can fix these structural problems, how we can increase Indigenous representation and the Indigenous voice into policy outcomes that affect Indigenous peoples. We should be looking at how we can strengthen our democracy, look at what's happening in other parts of the world and say, we may have an opportunity to do something better here. A similar history, a similar struggle, but a potentially different outcome building on the strengths of a democracy here compared to what is an absolutely parlous state of democracy in places like the US.
Stan Grant, it's always great to speak to you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.